Putin has just been humiliated. Ukraine has taken back a piece of vital land, territory that Russian forces spent months trying to capture, and now it's gone. Just like that. This wasn't part of Russia's spring offensive plan. They were supposed to be gaining ground, not losing it. But Ukraine's latest move has turned the tide and exposed cracks in Putin's entire strategy. So what exactly happened? What makes this land so important? And what does this single loss mean for the rest of the war? Let's break it down. The news of Ukraine's massive win comes from an April 17th report published in the Kyiv Independent. The outlet reports that the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrskyi, recently visited a number of his country's brigades on the front lines in Donetsk. There, he learned that Ukraine's careful planning and intelligent operations had resulted in a massive win. The country has retaken around 6.17 square miles of territory in the Pokrovsk region. That territory includes regions near a trio of vital settlements, including Shevchenko, Udachny, and Kotline. Syrskyi was jubilant when delivering the news. Over the course of 3 days, I visited almost all brigades of this powerful grouping of Ukrainian defense forces, which bears the brunt of the enemy's spring offensive and destroys its best forces and means, the Ukrainian military commander proclaimed. He's not wrong. In addition to recapturing a vital chunk of territory from the Russians, the operational tactical group Donetsk, that hosted Syrskyi for 3 days, is also halting around 30 Russian operations per day. Putin's forces are suffering significant losses as a result, and those losses open the door for operations allowing Ukraine to retake territory. And it's likely going to get worse for Putin. Syrskyi's visit focused on areas of the Donetsk front line that Ukraine could improve. The Ukrainian military leader met with brigade commanders in Donetsk to review operation plans, revealing that Ukraine is struggling with issues that include ammunition supply, logistics, and combat organization. All three are noted and being addressed, claims Syrskyi, which is terrible news for Putin. As his forces in Pokrovsk grow weaker, Ukraine is only going to become more efficient and effective. Do you need an example? Well, also on April 17th, the Kyiv Independent reported of just one of Ukraine's successful defenses against Russia's recent offensive maneuvers in the Pokrovsk region. Ukraine's 14th Chernova-Kalina Brigade came up against a large Russian force that clearly had the goal of retaking some of the territory Russia just lost to Ukraine. That force included hundreds of Russian troops, many of which were riding in armored combat vehicles and motorcycles. It's believed that Putin deployed 2 companies in his desperate attempt to retake land near Pokrovsk. The offensive failed. Ukraine killed around 200 Russian soldiers, injured another 30, and destroyed 115 units of valuable Russian military hardware. And therein lies the problem for Putin. He's losing territory in a vital area of Ukraine because his forces are already depleted. However, Russia's leader simply can't stop ordering offensives in the region, else he'll reduce the level of pressure he's exerting on Ukraine. Those fresh offensives are carried out by drained Russian soldiers, resulting in massive casualty rates, such as those seen on April 17th. So Russia is caught in a vicious cycle. Each offensive move it makes results in a gradual weakening that makes each attack that follows significantly weaker. Ukraine takes advantage of this growing weakness to launch counterattacks of its own, which leads to Russia losing more territory. If you need any evidence of that, remember something we just mentioned a moment ago. Putin ordered his troops to attack Pokrovsk on motorcycle. That form of transportation offers no protection against Ukraine's hordes of drones or its artillery fire. So we come back to the headline. Ukraine has just reclaimed 6.18 square miles of territory from Russia, and based on everything we know about Putin's offensives in Donetsk at the moment, the odds are that more territorial wins lie in Ukraine's future. But that brings us to a question. Why is Pokrovsk so important in the first place? The BBC explained in an August 2024 report in which it pointed out that Pokrovsk plays a vital role as a logistics hub the Ukrainian military uses to keep its forces stocked up in the Donbas region. First, note the date of that report, August 2024, is over half a year ago, which shows you just how long Putin has been fighting to take control of the territory that Ukraine just claimed. Pokrovsk is home to a key railway station, the BBC reports. In addition to the town being located at the intersection of several roads that lead to different areas of Ukraine, so its utility is clear. Ukraine transports military hardware and soldiers into Pokrovsk, with all being redirected to where they're needed most on the front lines. By taking the town, Putin not only gains all the logistical advantages it provides, but also deprives Ukraine of a key way of supplying its forces in the Donbas region Putin has battered for much of 2024 and into 2025. Ukraine had hoped to protect Pokrovsk in less than conventional ways back in August. The town, which is home to 69,000 people, most of whom are employed in machine building, coal mining, and metallurgy, has been evacuated. When Ukraine launched its Kursk counter-invasion, also in 2024, it had hoped to force Putin's forces to divert from Pokrovsk to defend Russia's territory. that didn't happen, at least not to the extent that Ukraine had hoped. Putin instead amassed a fighting force of 50,000 in Kursk, including around 10,000 North Korean soldiers, to slowly retake that territory. Putin's assaults on Pokrovsk intensified toward the end of 2024, and that created other problems. For one, Pokrovsk is known as Ukraine's coal mining capital, and with good reason. It's home to the largest coking coal plant in the country, which is a vital resource that's used by the steel industry to produce the coke needed to make materials. Therein lies another reason Putin wants Pokrovsk. Gaining access to these coking coal facilities would be a boon to his country, as it's dealing with an equipment manufacturing crisis. Taking Pokrovsk along with similar industrial regions would take a bite out of Ukraine's economy. We see that in the state of Ukraine's steel industry since Putin launched his invasion in February 2022. In that year, Ukraine's steel production fell by 70.7% as it focused most of its efforts on repelling Putin's forces. Output dropped to 6.3 million tons in 2022 and declined again to around 6 million tons a year later. Ukraine is recovering from these steel production issues Russia has caused, but slowly. Its steel production, which again relies on the coking coal towns like Pokrovsk provides, has risen by 2.7% in 2025 so far. By retaking territory around Pokrovsk, Ukraine paves the way for a full assault against the Russian-occupied town. If it retakes that town, Ukraine's steel industry suddenly has the opportunity to regrow enormously. That's great news both for Ukraine's economy and its ability to manufacture steel for the weapons it produces domestically. Russia's capture of Pokrovsk would also hold massive symbolic and practical consequences for the Ukraine war. As one unnamed soldier told the BBC back in August, the fall of Pokrovsk would lead to the total destruction of these cities and a lot of people dead and a lot of suffering. After that, there will be more cities. So I really hope we will stop them on the outskirts of Myrnarad and Pokrovsk. Of course, that didn't happen. Russia managed to take areas in and around Pokrovsk. As Russia continues its slow push to eradicate the last Ukrainian forces from Kursk, Ukraine has started its own push to liberate Pokrovsk entirely from its Russian invaders. The retaking of over 6 square miles of territory around the vital town means Ukraine now has the opportunity to launch a more significant offensive, using that reclaimed territory as a jumping-off point. Putin may have reclaimed Kursk from Ukraine, but in return, he stands to lose one of the most vital towns in Donbass. There's one more reason why Pokrovsk is so vital. It lies just 12.4 miles away from the administrative border of the Donetsk region. By reaching that border, Putin will finally achieve the goal of capturing Donetsk, which he's had since he first started his campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014. Right now, his forces control around 60% of the Donetsk Oblast. With Ukraine still able to coordinate its defense from the administrative border, Pokrovsk provides Russia with a potential route to that border, which in turn would give it control over Donetsk and an opportunity to push even deeper into Ukraine. Now Russia's forces are losing territory in this vital region, pushing Putin's ambitions for Donetsk even further out of his reach. By now it's clear that Russia's forces aren't doing what Putin needs them to do in Pokrovsk. That leads us to an obvious question: how did this happen? A large part of the reason comes down to how badly Russia's offensive operations have faltered as we move deeper into 2025. Multiple sources report that Russia is capturing far less territory per month now than it was at any point in 2024. The Kyiv Independent is one of those sources. On April 1st, it shared battlefield data from the monitoring group Deep State, which claims that Russia only managed to seize about 51 square miles of Ukrainian territory in March 2025. That may sound like a lot, especially when compared to the 6 square miles or so Ukraine just recaptured in Pokrovsk. However, that territory capture rate amounts to the lowest that Russia has achieved since June 2024. In other words, Russia's gains are on a rapid. Deep State says that we can see this when we track Russia's gains from its peak in November 2024. In that month, Putin's forces took almost 280 square miles of Ukrainian territory. They managed that because Ukraine's forces were overstretched in Donetsk, allowing Russia to take advantage. Ukraine has managed to strengthen its defenses since, resulting in Russia's gains slowing to about 154 square miles in December, 123 square miles in January, 72 square miles in February, and then finally the tiny 51 square miles in March. Other sources provide similar figures. The UK's Ministry of Defence claims a similar decline, stating that Russia took 55 square miles of Ukraine in March compared to 126 square miles in January. The Washington-based Institute for the Study of War paints a slightly rosier picture for Russia. It says Putin's forces took 165 square miles of Ukraine in January, down to 78 square miles in March. But whichever source has the most accurate figures almost doesn't matter. What does matter is that there's a clear pattern on display here. Russia is gaining far less territory now than it has at any point during the previous 6 months. Don't underestimate the importance of this slowdown to Ukraine and its efforts to counter Russia's aggression. It shows that Ukraine's defensive tactics are achieving their goal of depleting Russia's forces, creating opportunities for counterattacks like the one we've just seen in Pokrovsk. It also strikes a morale blow against Russia for a simple reason. Putin's forces are supposed to be engaged in a massive spring offensive. At least that's according to both Syrskyi and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Back in March, Zelensky warned that Russia was amassing forces for a renewed offensive that would likely focus on the Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts. Syrskyi reinforced those claims on April 9th, stating, "I can say that the president is absolutely right, and this offensive has effectively already begun." He added that Russian offensive operations had nearly doubled across all main sectors of the war. Why does this matter? Well, Putin's launching of a new spring offensive, particularly one that appears to focus primarily on Ukraine's northeast, suggests that he was confident in the work Russia accomplished in Donetsk the previous year. It was gaining ground in Pokrovsk along with several other key territories. Russia had also consolidated those territories by setting up defenses within them. That gave Putin the confidence to switch his focus to other areas of Ukraine, especially after the success he experienced in pushing Ukraine's forces out of Kursk. Ukraine capturing over 6 square miles of territory in Pokrovsk throws a massive wrench into those workings of Putin's spring offensive plans. Now he has to dedicate even more troops and resources to a region that he thought he'd secured months ago. The knock-on effect is that the already faltering offensives in Sumy and Kharkiv grow weaker, as Russia is forced to spread resources further across the Ukraine war's front lines to stop a Ukrainian advance deeper into Pokrovsk. That's where it gets really bad. After all, another reason why Ukraine just managed to achieve what it did in Pokrovsk is that Russia's military is running low on practically everything. We got a hint of this when we examined the failed April 17th Russian offensive in Pokrovsk earlier. Putin is sending his forces to assault Ukrainian positions on motorcycles, which is almost a guaranteed way to get your troops cut down by drone and artillery fire. But what Putin doesn't want Ukraine to know is just how severe his equipment problems really are. No matter where you look, Russia is dealing with shortfalls that are going to impact its spring offensive and lead to more situations like the one that allowed Ukraine to reclaim over 6 miles of territory near Pokrovsk. Take personnel as an example. In February 2025, United 24 media reported that the Russian military has suffered the irrecoverable loss of almost half of its total personnel since Putin launched his invasion. That's according to a military expert named Yuri Fedorov, who pointed to data from the International Institute for Strategic Studies that claims that Ukraine has killed 172,000 Russian soldiers and wounded a further 611,000. It's the wounded figures that are the big headline here. Of those 611,000 who suffered injury, only 235,000 have returned to the battlefield. The other 376,000 soldiers have suffered injuries so severe that they can't head back to Ukraine. As a result, Russia's irrecoverable losses stand at approximately 550,000 soldiers and officers, half of the total pre-war strength of the Russian armed forces, including naval and air force personnel, Fedorov told United 24. Worse yet for Putin, Russia's federal budget data reveals that it was recruiting around 1,000 new soldiers per day. That sounds like a lot until you realize that these recruitment figures came at a time when it was losing about 1,500 troops daily in Ukraine. Things aren't getting much better for Russia. On April 15th, it lost 1,050 soldiers, along with 9 of its tanks, in a single day. And that brings us to another problem Russia faces that makes things like Ukraine's recent Pokrovsk exploits possible. Putin is also running out of tanks. According to Pavel Lutzin, who's a defense analyst with the Center for European Policy Analysis, Russia can only manufacture around 60 new tanks per year. The rest of the supposedly new tanks it's sending to Ukraine are actually tanks pulled from Russia's Soviet-era stockpiles that it refurbishes. Those stockpiles are running low. With Russia having already sent the best of its older stock into Ukraine, what's left are the dregs, the tanks that weren't deemed good enough to enter Ukraine in the past because they take longer to restore and are in worse states of disrepair than the tanks Russia has already sent. That's a massive problem when you consider that Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia has lost 10,662 of its tanks already. Divide that by 38 months of the Ukraine war, and we get a monthly loss rate of around 280 tanks. Building 60 new tanks per month isn't going to offer much when Russia is losing over 4.5 times that many. There are other areas where Russia is suffering from shortfalls. Armored vehicles are in as short supply as tanks, as demonstrated by Putin sending his soldiers into battle on motorcycles. Russia is also running low on artillery, which only further weakens both its assaults on Ukraine's positions and its ability to defend itself against Ukrainian counterattacks. It all adds up to a simple fact: Putin's military is getting weaker by the month. And that leads us to the final reason Ukraine managed to pull off what it just did in Pokrovsk. As Russia grows weaker, Ukraine becomes stronger. That fact was highlighted by the Atlantic Council in March 2025 when it published a piece discussing how Ukraine's growing military strength is an underrated factor in the peace talks intended to bring an end to the war. It points out that Ukraine has about 1 million soldiers defending its country at a time when Russia has lost 50% of its pre-war force and is struggling to replace the manpower Putin churns through with his meat grinder tactics. Ukraine's army is backed by a highly motivated and rapidly expanding domestic military-industrial complex that is harnessing the excellence of Ukraine's pre-war tech sector and reviving long-neglected Soviet-era capabilities, the Atlantic Council adds. In other words, as Russia pulls from its depleted Soviet stockpiles to keep the war going, Ukraine is only just tapping into the experience it developed during that era to make itself stronger. We see that in Ukraine's defense industry. When Putin launched his invasion, that industry had about $1 billion of capacity per year. By the end of 2025, that number is expected to reach $35 billion. And it has the potential to grow higher, especially if Ukraine can remove limitations on its defense budget. Even as it stands today, Ukraine is building around a third of the weapons, equipment, and ammunition it's using against Russia, in addition to becoming a global leader in drone production. What does all of this mean? Ukraine's ability to defend itself and, in the future, launch more attacks is only growing as Russia's capabilities decline. That's what makes Putin's spring offensive so desperate. He's launching it at a time when Russia simply isn't capable of taking the amount of territory it needs to take. As Ukraine grows even stronger, it'll successfully defend against this offensive and create even more gaps in the front line. So the 6 square miles in Pokrovsk is just the starting point. As the war drags deeper into 2025, we're likely going to see Ukraine take even more territory, thanks to the growing strength of its forces and Russia's developing weakness. That can only spell bad news for Putin. Right now, he wants to take territory in Sumy and Kharkiv. That's the goal of his spring offensive. But the reality he has to face is that he should be far more concerned with Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia holds 60% of the former and 98.5% of the latter. Ukraine just proved it can retake territory in these key regions. Look for Russia to lose even more as we move deeper into 2025. But what do you think about what Ukraine's forces just achieved in Pokrovsk? Does this represent a turning point in the war as Ukraine draws closer to retaking a key logistical hub? How will Putin respond, assuming he can respond at all? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine war. Now go and check out why Ukraine's invasion of Russia changed everything, or click this other video instead.